Good afternoon, friends. So now the next three lectures will be delivered by our expert, Dr. S.K. Mishraji. And Sri Mishraji is former outstanding scientist from Bhava Atomic Research Center. And post-retirement from BRC, he worked with National Disaster Management Authority for some 10 years as a senior consultant nuclear and radiological emergencies. He has very wide experience in operation, design and development of nuclear research reactors, in safety and regulatory inspections of various nuclear facilities. And he worked with NDMA as senior consultant and was responsible for various activities related to nuclear and radiological emergencies. So without taking any further time, I request Sri Mishraji, Sri S.K. Mishraji, to take over for today's class. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra, Course Director. Good afternoon to all of you. I am happy to be part of this course on disaster management, CBR and emergency, launched by Homi Bhabha National Institute. The course has already been given the startup energy, I would say booster energy by our beloved Chancellor, Dr. Anil Kakkukar sir, and Dr. Kamchi Mudli, Vice Chancellor, SBNI. An important portion of the course has been amply covered by the course director, Dr. Mishra, and the session by CSK Ghosh, which has set the tone for moving forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I will discuss the important areas of disaster management in 3 sessions and on radiological emergency management sometimes in the last week or third week of December. You will find some of the terminologies being repeated in all the lectures connected to disaster management, but they will cover these terminologies, these subjects through different angles as it applies. So let me begin with first slide. So the basic attributes, the important attributes in any disaster. See, first thing is this word disaster management looks like oxymoron. There's a disaster which has to be managed. Okay. So the various attributes part of the disaster and disaster management, will cover them one by one. We'll discuss them one by one. Most of it is like a common sense topics, and we will have a slight insight relevant for our program. Well, in disaster, the most important aspect is what can lead to damage. How much is the potential which can lead to damage of the 3 priorities: life, property, and environment. And how serious is the risk? So the disaster risk word, which is used at every stage of disaster management, I will just try to cover through these lines, these sentences. The potential loss of life, human life or animal life, injury or, can you move this? Injury or destroyed or damaged assets. That means property. The first thing is life and property, which could occur to a system, society, or a community. This will be further come, it will be elaborated in a specific period of time. So very important, the damage, the loss is in how much time. Determine probability as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. I think every word of this definition is important. The potential loss of life, injury, or damage to the assets in a specified time period determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. Now, this is disaster risk. The definition of disaster risk reflects the concept of hazardous events, which will be covered when we follow further, and disasters at the outcome of continuously present conditions of risk. Now, risk I'm going to cover in a separate couple of PPTs. What is risk? And this word is used very commonly in the society, but how to define risk, which can vary from person to person, which can vary from society to society. The disaster risk comprises of different types of potential losses, which are often difficult to quantify. Now, please catch this word. Sometimes it is difficult to quantify. You will see this example down the line. Nevertheless, with knowledge of the prevailing hazards and the patterns of population and socio-economic development, disaster risk can be assessed and mapped in broad terms at least. Now, this is very important, how to quantify risk. A disaster risk for one person, a disaster risk for one community may not be same for another person, another community. And if the risk is different, so is the preparedness. You differ preparedness. Accordingly, the response also changes. So very important to first find out what is disaster risk. It is important to consider the social and economic context in which disaster risks occur, and that the people do not necessarily share the same perception. As I have said, different people have different perception. Loss of one person for one community will be much different than another person in the community. Now, a simple looking definition is the basic foundation of disaster management, disaster preparedness. Now let us move further. When you talk about risk, the risk can be further graded. No, it's like a graded approach. What is the risk? Which is a minimum risk, which is a minimum benchmark. You cannot eliminate, or you have to pay very exorbitant for removal of that risk. And what is acceptable risk? All right. So as the lines go like this, what is acceptable risk? Let me first read the second para. What is the residual risk? This is a risk, you have to live with it. Or this is a risk that disaster managers have to accept in their disaster preparation. If something happens more than that, it is part of the system, or some people may call it part of fate. Residual risk is the disaster risk that remains even when effective disaster risk reduction measures are taken. You take all the measures to address the disaster in your preparedness, in your infrastructure, in resources, but that cannot be removed. That means you start with basic. It is like you take a cup of tea and at the end you leave 1 spoon of tea as a residual tea that you cannot take. So you have to live with it. Otherwise, for removal of that residual risk or for minimizing it further, the cost is exorbitant. So residual risk, disaster risk that remains even when effective disaster risk reduction measures are in place, and for which emergency response and recovery capacities must be maintained. The presence of residual risk implies a continuing need to develop and support effective capacities for emergency services. I repeat, the presence of residual risk, that means the residual risk which is there as a part of the design or which is accepted, implies a continuing need to develop and support effective capacities for emergency services, preparedness, response, and recovery, together with socio-economic policies as part of a holistic approach. Look, here the word holistic approach, your resources or your resource capacity is embedded. That means you live with this much of risk, which is part of the system, or you accept this much of risk. Not good to talk, but whatever is lost in terms of life or health or property is worth accepting is instead of spending more money, more budget, more resources to remove the residual risk. So if this is the case, then what is acceptable risk? What do you accept? Or you can also call it tolerable risk. It is an important subterm. The extent to which a disaster risk is deemed acceptable. That depends on existing social, economic, cultural, technical, and environmental conditions. The extent to which a disaster risk is deemed acceptable. That means your society accepts, your government accepts, you accept. In engineering terms, acceptable risk is also used to assess and define the structural and non-structural measures that are needed in order to reduce possible harm to people, property, services, and systems to chosen tolerated level. That means you start your design, you start your preparation with these are my boundary conditions. You accept that much. Below that, outside that is residual risk. Okay. How do you assess? What is assessment of risk? Now we start the disaster. The foundation is risk. You have residual risk, you have acceptable risk. Now how do you assess? A qualitative or quantitative? I repeat this, qualitative or quantitative. All the risk calculations, all the assessment cannot be converted in term of quantitative. Let us say it cannot be converted in form of finance. There are so many aspects in disaster, we'll again cover down the line, which cannot be quantitative. So they are qualitative. To determine the nature and extent of disaster risk by analyzing potential hazards. Now, these are also the terms which are good to speak, but difficult to analyze, and they will sound vague when you start quantifying what is hazard, how much is the hazard, and evaluating existing conditions of exposure and vulnerability. So, determine the nature and extent of disaster risk by analyzing potential hazards and evaluating existing conditions of exposure and vulnerability that together could harm people, property, services, livelihoods, and the environment on which they depend. The identification of hazards, a review of the technical characteristic of hazards, such as their location, intensity, frequency, and probability. Location, intensity, frequency, and probability. The analysis of exposure, vulnerability, including the physical, social, health, environmental, and economic damage. That means everything which is there for the society. And the evaluation of the effectiveness of prevailing and alternative coping capacities with respect to lively scenarios. Now, these are all the things which are included in disaster risk assessment. To be more specific to hazard, a process, a phenomenon, or human activity that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation. That is hazard. Hazards may be natural or anthropogenic or socio-natural in origin. So let's come back to this. A process, phenomena, or human activity. Now, very important for CBRN responders or those who are in the CBRN emergency management. A process, a phenomena, or human activity. Because CBRN comes under human activity, which is also called man-made disaster. That may cause loss of life, injury, or health impacts, or other damages. It could be natural or sorry. It could be natural. There are dozens of examples of natural hazards, or it could be anthropogenic. Anthropogenic is like something done by human, something done by persons, which influences nature, or socio-natural in origin. Natural hazards are predominantly associated with natural processes and phenomena. Okay, CBRN does not fall under this category. And anthropogenic hazards or human-induced hazards are induced entirely or predominantly by human activities and choices. This term does not include the occurrence or risk of armed conflicts. Now, anything which is done as a part of lifestyle or by human being, which can influence the nature, which can damage the environment, they come under this category. But for the purpose of disaster management, the armed conflicts or whatever damages happen during wartime, that is not covered under this anthropogenic hazards, and that is why they do not get any place in disaster management. That's a separate subject. Several hazards are socio-natural in that they are associated with a combination of natural and anthropogenic factors, including environmental degradation and climate change. Now, this is a very big issue which is separately discussed by government, by societies, and they have got remedies which requires everybody's commitment. Hazards may be single, sequential, or combined. Hazard can be simple, and there could be something which is like a cascading effect. A hazard which causes another hazard to happen. The example is, let us say, tsunami led to a nuclear reactor accident in Fukushima, Japan. So that is how the sequential are combined in their origin and effects. Each hazard is characterized by its location, intensity. This is very, very important because hazard is too much local. Some places get frequent earthquakes, some places get, let us say, uh, tornado, some places get drought very often. I'm just telling you diversified. So they are all like local effect. And probability. Biological hazards are also defined by their infectiousness or toxicity that we already know. Biological effect, the world is going through a very major biological hazard, biological emergency, that is COVID. Now, there could be multi-hazard, which means selection of multi-major hazards that the country faces. When you start studying the multi-hazards of a country, when you start planning, then these are things which have to be known. One hazard combines with another hazard. The specific context where hazard events may occur simultaneously in the cascading manner or cumulatively over time, and taking into account the potential interrelated effects. Now, these are all multi-hazards. Oh. Now, natural hazard include, as mentioned in Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-30, and listed here is biological, environmental, geological, hydrometeorological, and technological. So all the hazards are classified or further discussed, or let us say further categorized under these 5 categories. Now, important for our course is human-induced disaster. Now, this has been made gender neutral. It is not just man-made or man-induced. It is human-induced disasters, which was earlier very commonly referred as man-made, is due to hazards due to CBRN threat and events. And events hazards due to CBRN threats and events rank very high among the causes that are human-induced risk, X. Now, this particular hazard, which is human-induced, has a big potential of malicious activities and secondary incidents arising from intentional and non-intentional activities. So CBRN comes under human and man-made or human-made. Now, for a country, for a nation, let us say for India, for Bharat, there has to be a national document, there has to be a national data bank that tells area specific, location specific, and maybe community specific information or data on disaster risk. Intensive and extensive disaster risk. The intensive and extensive disaster are given below in the same PPT. Either have a potential impact that is significant and relevant for the nation as a whole, and or require national disaster risk management coordination. Now, this is a part of national disaster risk data. The data which is available, the data which is generated are data which are worked out by apps or simulations. Now, just to explain further, the boundaries of national disaster risk depend on the purpose and scoping of national disaster risk assessment process. This is defined in each country. Now, this is location based. Now, in each country and particular location, taking into account existing governance and disaster risk management policies. Different countries have different disaster risk priorities and policies. Accordingly, and whatever is affected now, some places are more into earthquake, some are volcano, some are cyclone, and surprisingly, I found some places sinkhole. Now, this word sinkhole, not many people will know in our country because we don't face it. But that is also a disaster, though the open data does not give much of casualties or much of life loss. But still, it is noted as an emergency in some of the places. And what is extensive disaster risk is the disasters which occur very often, but the severity is low. Now, this again is a relative topic because whatever is to cause very severe loss once upon a time, because of the management, because of preparedness, now it has become less severe. The burning example is cyclone in many coastal areas. Okay, and the intensive disaster is the risk associated with high severity and low frequency. Now, high severity and low frequency are cases where it happens very less. The frequency is very less. But whenever it happens, it brings lot of severity, lot of damage, damage in property, in life, and the important thing is it causes a very severe trauma to the society. So extensive disaster, intensive disaster, the disasters which happen more often, disasters which happen less often. Now let us say exposure. We have discussed hazard, risk, acceptable risk, residual risk. Now let us say what is exposure. See, combination of all these only lead to the final data and disaster management. Exposure. The situation of population, the situation of persons, infrastructure, housing, production capacities and other tangible human assets located in the area which is affected by disaster or which are disaster prone or let us say hazard prone. Those are the people, infrastructure, housing, they are exposed to the high hazard and risk. Measures of exposure can include the number of people or types of assets. If you have a bigger population, bigger civil population, we need to give more attention there. We need to have more resources, infrastructure there for preparedness. These can be combined with a specific vulnerability. Why specific vulnerability? That depends when you have got type of population who depend more on the responders. They are themselves not able to manage. There the vulnerability is high, and there are certain categories of the society which require somebody to help them. They cannot manage themselves because of whatever reason, health, age, gender. To any particular hazard, to estimate the quantitative risk associated with that hazard in the area of interest. So measures of exposure, all these. Vulnerability, capacity, and coping capacity. Vulnerability is the conditions determined by various conditions, physical, social, economic, environmental, or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual or a community assets or systems to the impacts of hazard. Catch this word, impact of hazards. I am going to discuss it again after a couple of slides, couple of PPTs. And what is capacity? Now, capacity has much to do in your management or preparedness factor. If you have higher capacity, you can accordingly face more severe hazards, more severe disasters. Combination of all strength, attributes and resources. That is the capacity within your organization, community or society to manage and reduce disaster risk and strengthen resilience. What is the meaning? Strengthen resilience. That means we have strength, attributes, resources, everything in the community, which makes it resilient. The community can face. Capacity may include infrastructure, institutions, human knowledge and skills, and collective attributes such as social relationship, leadership, and management. So this is the overall capacity of the capacity available. Let us say the system or the government or the institution has given this much capacity. We'll make it, I would say, very useful subset, the coping capacity. Now you have capacity, I bring it to a more refined, a more applicable word, coping capacity. Coping capacity is the availability of the people, organizations, and systems using available skill and resources to manage adverse conditions, risk, or disasters. Important line, the capacity to cope requires continuing awareness, resources, good management, both in normal times as well as during disasters or adverse conditions. Coping capacities contribute to the reduction of disaster risk. Very, very useful, very important. Now, coping capacity means you've got resources, you've got infrastructure, you've got material, you've got people, everything. But it requires continuing awareness, good management. If you have got a capacity and a good coping capacity by the affected people or the affected area or the potentially affected area, we can reduce our disaster. It reduces greatly in the reduction of disaster risk. The risk is much less. Well, this is not exactly analytical, but I would say very vague analytical. Research, a lot of research is going on in the various field of disaster. There are a lot of simulations available, but there is nothing like general simulation and there is nothing like general formula. There is nothing like universal, one formula applicable to everywhere. It is all based on location, type of hazard, risk, people, capacity, coping capacity, and past data, all those things are there. But if you see the word risk, simple English, the risk the word risk is the chances of bad thing to happen. You never use the word, never we use the word risk in something good. We always say if something bad can happen, that is a risk. Okay. When it comes to financial risks, it has slightly related definition. Medical professionals also use this word risk. They tell the patient what is the risk involved in a particular medical procedure for a treatment or for investigation, whatever. When it comes to disaster, the risk word is a combination of the probability of happening when a disaster or when hazardous things can occur and what will be its damage. In simple words, risk is related to a combination of impact and probability. And most of the time, it is multiplication. If the impact is high and the probability is high, the risk is very high. It is multiplied. Okay. Another type of equation that I have seen, which is used, is the same thing with different terminology. Risk is equal to hazard in combination with vulnerability. The Federal Emergency Management Authority, USA, they use the word risk is equivalent to likelihood into consequences. Okay, that means if the consequences are high and likelihood is less, likelihood means because of low exposure, because of return period is less, vagara vagara, so such and such, then the risk is less. Or let us say something, the consequences are low, but the likelihood is very high. It happens every year, like then the risk is high because It's an annual loss in terms of risk assessment is high. And everything leads to only one thing, that if it comes to risk planning, disaster planning, then it is expected annual loss. Sometimes the data is available and it is projected, and sometimes the data is purely estimated based on simulations. And the community risk factor. Now, how good is the community? You will know, I don't have to highlight. India is a country with all, all boundaries, all mountains, a very long, a very long coastline, disaster prone areas. The communities are prepared. If you go to some places where the earthquake is happening very often, like Northeast, the community has got a lot of preparation for that. So this is a relation between social vulnerability. Now, social vulnerability is not one, it is a community, and the community resilience and mind wealth. Don't miss this. Notice this. This is percentile. It is never absolute. It is a percentile. Okay. So percentile I have written like this. L is small. Okay. It is not percentage. Now this varies from community to community, location to location. So the risk is what are the chances of happening, then how often it will happen, what is the community's preparedness, or what is, let us say, community's likelihood of facing or managing all these things together. And the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Authority, USA, gives the same, everything is same, different English terminology. Okay. And once the risk is known, once the risk is known, it becomes very convenient, very simple to move forward for the disaster management. That means preparedness. These are the some examples. Hazard could be, if it is natural hazard, it could be flood, cyclone, landslide, earthquake, drought, epidemic, etc. And there could be something like local hazards, which are like specific to local areas. Okay, like one thing which has been, I just mentioned is sinkhole. Sinkhole is not used in our places, but it is there. If you go to literature, there are a lot of research papers. There are people who have given their whole life in researching on sinkholes. Sinkholes could be as deep as 160, 170 meter deep, and maybe some 300, 400 meters wide, like which can become a big problem in cities. Vulnerability can be socio-economic, development, deprivation, economic inadequacy, uprooted people, including children. Now, capacity is institutional, governance, disaster risk reduction, preparedness, relief items, healthcare, and communication. Now, these parts we have discussed. And how to mitigate risk. The risk mitigation is moderating the severity of a hazard impact. That is risk mitigation.
Yes, let me see.
I'm sorry, there was some technical issue. The voice was lost. I will just saying that this PPT is the last in the topic for winding up. Now, hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacities are dynamic. Now, dynamic means they change as a result of changes of.
सर आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही है.
Is it okay, sir? आवाज आ रही है? आवाज आ रही है?
Now it's okay.
Okay,
Now it's okay.
sorry. So hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacities, which are all the various attributes in disaster preparedness, disaster management, are dynamic in nature. They are dynamic because things change. The land use change, the land cover change, the urbanization, construction practice, regulations. Regulations are like rules. They keep on changing. And technological innovations. Technologies are great in disaster management, very useful. At the same time, they also lead to some risk. Other processes further impact the dynamics of hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, capacity, and their interactions, including underlying root causes such as climate change. I think there is no dispute on that point. Climate change is a big factor. Population growth, another big factor. But we have to work under given conditions. That means the climate is changing, population growth is there. That is also changing the demographic structure. The disaster preparedness has to be done according to that. So these are the various factors which require constant updation of disaster planning, disaster management, disaster preparedness, and the gaps and equalities, gaps and poverties. These are all important in disaster preparedness. How do you change your disaster preparedness, change infrastructure? That depends on, and they are constantly updated. All right, we take a break now. We take a break for maybe how much? 5 minutes, as the course director tells me. क्या जाओ रोहित ब्लू कलर है मतलब चालू है इट्स ऑलरेडी ऑन नाउ all right so we are back. There was one question. One of the participants raised the point. Hmm? Yeah. Somebody asked what is F? This is a simple way of writing as a function. Function. That means community risk factor is a function of social vulnerability and community resilience. It is expressed as percentile. It has a longer annotation, longer description, but I am stopping it here. All right. So all right. So now another attribute required in disaster management preparation is the impact. How to assess impact in case of a disaster? Now, this is easily said than done. It is not easy to explain sorry for the short interruption. It was related to some technological issue, net fluctuation, internet fluctuation. Disaster impact is the total effect in terms of loss of economic loss, including negative effects, economic losses or economic gains. Now, this is very important. How there could be gain in disaster impact. So I read it. Disaster impact is the total effect, including negative effects, that is economic losses, and positive effects, for example, economic gains of a hazardous event or a disaster. The term includes economic, human, and environmental impacts. Economic, human, and environmental impacts, and may include injuries, death, disease, and other negative effects on human, physical, mental, and social. Now, very important is this gives a big challenge. How to assess? The whole world has gone through this epidemic, COVID epidemic, and the I would say the pathological part is largely over. But the human psychology, mental issues are emerging and they are more prominently being discussed. Difficult to quantify them in terms of disaster impact. Okay, so the losses. Now, I would like to say what is economic gain? How there could be economic gain in a disaster? Now, this gain is not to be taken as an individual gain, not to be taken as a particular industry's gain. All right. So let us say in the pandemic time, some fraternities were suffered a great loss. Some fraternities made reasonably good or good business. Okay. Okay. But economic gains is for the whole nation or the whole community, not for individual. Say, for example, if in the preparedness, in the disaster preparation, uh, along the coastline in India, I think some 7,300, 400 kilometers of our coastline, all over, most of the areas are prone to cyclone. Now, under a World Bank finance scheme, Government of India through National Disaster Management Authority has constructed cyclone shelters, a huge numbers of cyclone shelters all along the coast, all along the coast. Now, the advantage or the gain of this I would say risk reduction steps taken under the NDMA's activities is whenever there is a cyclone, you get enough warning time. The community can be moved. They take shelter there, and once the disaster or the cyclone is over, they go back and resume their normal life. The losses have become purely individual from unaccounted and 15,000, 20,000 deaths. Now it has become a single figure death. It may be maybe like 1 or 10 like this for the same type of disaster. Now the construction of this huge number of cyclone shelters when there is no cyclone is used by community and that leads to gain. That is a gain by community. It is a very big project of 10,000 crores and then second phase 10,000 crores funded by Government of India and World Bank. Economic loss, total economic impact that consists of direct economic loss and indirect economic losses. This is coming under economic loss. Direct economic loss is the monetary value of total or partial destruction. Now this is visible. Whatever is damaged, the houses, the bridges, the hospital building, the school, mostly it is infrastructure which is lost. The production houses, that is economic loss, whether it is direct or indirect. Now direct economic loss is nearly equivalent to physical damage. Okay, so it can be worked out. The question is, it is post-disaster. But in case somebody has to work out a possible disaster with respect to a particular geography, with respect to particular location, with respect to particular, let us say, cyclone, wind speed. So this simulation also can be used, but it is absolutely difficult to find out the real value. But the damages or losses post-disaster can be worked out. Now, what are the factors? What are the disaster risk drivers or basically disaster risk factors? The processes or conditions often development related that influence the level of disaster risk by increasing levels of exposure. If the exposure and vulnerability is increased and the capacity is reduced, I repeat, I think it's very common sense. In case in a hazardous area, the exposure is increased, the vulnerability is increased, and the capacity is reduced. That is one big factor in disaster risk, increasing disaster risk. Okay. The drivers are referred to as underlying include poverty. I think this is very, very relevant for developing countries or third world countries, poverty and gender, they are the big factors in the sufferings of the people, or the extent to which the affected people or the poor people are affected, or the extent to the which the people who are not very well off, they suffer. Their damages, their losses are very, very high. The climate change, the variability, unplanned and rapid urbanization, and the lack of disaster risk considerations. These are not factored in land management. So whenever we go for land utilization because of high urbanization, these factors are many times ignored. That is land management, environmental and natural resources. That in long term becomes a bigger risk. They are the bigger risk drivers. Okay. No disaster is informed. The lack of regulations. And I would say in our country, with a little bit of pinch of salt, I would say, regulations are there, but they are not very meticulously followed. They are ignored under one pretext or the other pretext, thus to get for a short-term gain. They are bigger, equally big drivers in disaster risk. For private disaster reduction, imminent complex supply chains. Now, supply chain is one thing which is used by industries and suppliers. Now, if this is not properly done, it is very, very complex. That also causes disaster risk rise. Availability of technology, availability of technology, availability of technology to everybody has become very key in early warning, in alerting people, in communication during disaster. Very, very critical. We'll discuss it further in my lectures. Now to find out the disaster risk, how to assess. As I've told you, there are like fundamental first principle type of pen and paper type of calculations. One can find out the total inventory, the total hazard potential, the return period, all those things, and find out what is the disaster risk in a nation, and this will be locality wise, location based. But now with more and more application of technology, and I will also say availability of lot of data, because the data strengthens, like data, available data reinforces, and that becomes a basis for projections. There are no tools available, and ISO, International Organization on Standardization, number 31010. This is a tool where the disaster risk can be assessed. It has 12 elements. Those elements can be filled, but just to fill the element and allot particular number, particular values, that still remains a personal assessment, or let us say the local expertise. The three risks, that is, which consists of, it starts with setting the context, and then the three steps are risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. I think very simple to understand. This process, let us say it will come like this. In the next PPT, it will come like this. I go back. This process flow is given in ISO 1010, is the basis for most European assessment and for Australian national risk assessment. But our experts, our researchers also use the same funda. They also use the same criteria, but additional criteria are also included. This step is concerned and understanding the risk management context in order to define the purpose and scope of risk assessment. It includes engaging and consulting with stakeholders and defining criteria for decisions. Now, the process for national disaster risk assessment is more, I would say, accurate when we consult, when the values are cross-checked or when the values are enforced, after getting input from all the stakeholders, and then we define a criteria. Now, this is not an ordinary thing. How to define a situation in a graded system? Where do they stand? In a radiological emergencies, there are criteria which is already there given by IAEA, where the incidents can be graded from 0 to scale of 7. But for every other conditions, there are like local effects. So defining a criteria is important, but now with so much of data, with so much of experience, this is possible. Now I'm just giving you a short picture of that ISO mapping, where establishing contact, risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. They are specified, and this can be done further. I will try to discuss further because this requires more time and more PPTs. So I will come back. If those who are interested, you can always give a message. I will come back. Otherwise, the ISO 31010 is available, and I also try to do a little bit of numerical exercise on this. If possible, I will cover next time. Direct economic loss we have seen. Now, indirect economic loss, I would say it is more complex, very difficult, and a lot of things go by personal assessment. A decline in economic value added as a consequences of economic loss and are human and environmental impacts. Indirect economic loss includes microeconomic impacts. For example, revenue declines owing to business interruption. Microeconomic, macroeconomic, and mesoeconomic. These are the three economic, I would say, stages or three sectors. Microeconomic is one which depends upon personal buy and sell. Personal, what do you call? Supply chain. It is like individual. Macroeconomic is like group. Big. Okay, it's like a big group, even let us say like national. And in between the first tier and the next tier, there is in between, that is called mesoeconomic. Now, in disaster management, just to bring clarity, the three-tier system has been inducted. That is microeconomic, macroeconomic, and mesoeconomic. Now, these are three different impacts. That means something which are very, very localized, I would say. Let us say in the disaster management, we have got L0, L1, L2, L3. In microeconomic, I would say, let us say, for analogy purpose, not one-to-one example, it may be like L1, which is very, very special, local, or some individuals are affected, or some particular industries affected, or particular companies affected. When it goes to macro, it is larger population, like big state or nation. And mesoeconomic is in between. It's like a three-tier system. So I will read it. Indirect economic loss includes microeconomic impacts, mesoeconomic impacts, for example, revenue declines owing to impacts on natural assets, interruptions to supply chains, or temporary unemployment. And macroeconomic impacts, price increase in government debt, negative impact on stock market prices, and decline in GDP. Indirect losses can occur inside or outside of the hazard area and often have a time lag. Okay, mind this word. It may not be immediately possible because of, let us say, our inertia in the system, because so much of storage is available. People have got survival tricks, survival method. Okay, but in time to come, that means after time lag, this will be visible. As a result, they can be intangible or difficult to measure. Meaning of the effects, lot of effects, disaster effects. They may not be immediately understood. First thing is there are certain things which have got long time effect or let us say side effect. And there are certain things which have got, let us say somebody loses 2 years of time in education, 1 year or 2 years of time in employment. The time does not come back. So these are all also long time effect. Okay. This is just data which I think has been explained in the first lecture or second lecture. We have a very close relationship with disaster. India has got a very close relationship and barring a few, all sorts of disasters occur here. There are 27 states which are disaster prone, earthquake prone 58.6% land mass, flood and river erosion 12% out of 7,576 kilometer of coastline, 5,700 kilometer is prone to tsunami and cyclone. Around 60% area is drought prone area. And I will tell you that drought is the mother of disasters in our country. Drought is I would say parents of disaster. The drought preparedness and everything started with in disaster, everything is started with drought only. Landslide and avalanche prone, all hilly areas, then poverty and disaster vulnerability. This is very, very important. They are linked to naturally reinforcing disasters, and we suffer, or most of the countries like us suffer almost 2% of the GDP in disasters. And suppose we take preparedness seriously, this can be brought down to quite a impressive value. The state of readiness to deal with a threatening disaster, or some people also use the word like potential disaster, and the effects thereof. This is readiness. You are ready, you are prepared. That means in disaster, when it is a threatening disaster or a potential disaster, the word also is you are battle ready. That means whenever disaster comes, whenever disaster takes place, we are ready, we are poised. The state of readiness to deal with a threatening disaster, or let us say potential disaster or disaster and the effects thereof, is called preparedness. Hazard zonation, mapping and vulnerability analysis. Now the whole country, India, every location has a map. I would say like a disaster zonation map. Which area can face what type of disasters and to what extent. Like we already know there is a seismic zone called classification, zone 5, zone 4, zone 3 like this. Same thing in cyclone. All areas are marked and a very beautiful colored maps are available. I will try to project it. I will project it in one of the days. Risk vulnerability assessment of all disaster prone areas. Now this data is now available, but as I have already mentioned, it is a dynamic system. It is not, it's like one time we do and we are done. It has to be continuously updated, and new threat and new types of problems keep on coming. and now there's a combination of disasters will take place. The combinations also may change, but the base data is available. Risk informed decision making, three-stage approach. Establish probability and magnitude, evaluate the benefits and cost. Here comes the important thing is residual risk. What is the residual risk we expect or we accept? Set priorities so that the greatest social benefits are achieved at lowest cost. Now, cost is important. We have to make something, see, a system which is working in one country may not be so good in another country. One has to understand what is good. See, in one of the lectures, our Honorable Prime Minister said, when we talk of earthquake, there are century-old designs which are used in Gujarat Kutch area. They are called bunga. They make bungas and they never face earthquake, whatever, they never face the impact of the earthquake, whatever may be the intensity. So there is a need for adopting what is suitable there. It may not be high tech, it may be low tech, but that gives a proven data. All right. So I think we have discussed quite a bit about basic hazard, vulnerability, exposure, risk, acceptable risk, and so many terminologies which are used. Everybody's aim is only one. The aim is how to minimize disaster damage. International community has started working in this long time back because many countries have faced disaster and they were like hugely wiped off because of deep disasters. Japan of one of them. The country has suffered a lot because of natural disasters. They have also taken a lead directly in under United Nations. I would say one important strategy was adopted in Yokohama. Under this important step was followed. So far, till that time, disasters needed response. That means you react. Whenever there is a disaster, where the disaster has happened, rush there, whatever help, relief, remedy, evacuation, apply there. Now this is called reactive management. But with so much of technology, so much of data, so much of sufferings and lessons learned, the approach has changed from reactive to proactive. Why not we prepare ourselves in such a way that if the disaster or the hazard comes to your door, knocks at your door, you are able to manage it. So this is a big approach change. I think this is called a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift in the approach is from reactive to proactive, and our country, India, is also following this, and you have seen a big change in our disaster management and the losses, which have become very, very low. The next was Hogyo framework. This was also in the Japanese area. Okay, the core of the Hogyo framework for the action 2005 to 15, these are the 10 years period, consists of three strategic goals. 5 priorities for action and considerations for implementation and follow-up. Each priority action is associated with 10 to 15 activities to be pursued by states, communities. Priority action number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Priority number 1, ensure that disaster risk reduction is a priority with a strong institutional basis. That means there is one institution which has been made responsible, which is answerable for disaster risk reduction and under the government protocol or the government rule, the institution is answerable. Identify assets, assess and monitor disaster risk and enhance early warning. Most of the disasters, the damages impacts can be minimized if we just know. Sometimes a warning of a few minutes, sometimes a warning of a few hours is enough to save maybe thousands and lakhs of people in our populous country. Early warning is important. There has to be early warning, it reaches to the community and community follows it. Then use knowledge, innovation and education. Personally, I am a big believer of culture. See, what technology can give has its own limit. But if the culture is there, the technology can be adopted, followed, and this type of honest application in disaster management will be of great strength, great use for the community. Reduce the underlying risk factors. We have already discussed what are the risks, what the residual risk. Reduce the residual risk. You bring it further down by whatever method, by all the PL, let us say by early warning. Then strengthen disaster preparedness for effective response to all levels. Strengthen preparedness. Good preparedness. That means this is also institutional. Hogyo framework is a global document as such. It addresses disaster risk reduction issues in all types of environments and settings. But the mountains remain a marginal element in this document. PA4 paragraph number 19Q, I have not brought that here, calls on signatories, those countries which are involved in this, to incorporate disaster risk assessment into rural development planning and management. In particular, with regard to mountain and coastal floodplain areas, including through the identification of land zones that are available and safe for human settlement. Although the midterm review of the framework did not mention mountain areas explicitly, environmental issues in general were given more space. All right, so this Hogyo framework has not so much addressed the mountain issues, but it has done quite a bit at that time on disaster risk reduction. It has given, as I have said, like PA 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and many more like this. Okay. Now the latest is Sendai framework. Sendai framework is another, I would say, congregation of all the countries which are in the disaster management, which has given numerous consultations, conferences and workshops took place. The synthesis report on consultations on a post 2015 framework on disaster risk reduction noted that consultations yielded broad calls to address mismanagement of the environment, enhance social and environmental vulnerability. I would say in the Sendai framework, mountain received little attention, but the frequent mention of the environment and ecological systems was frequently mentioned in the consultation meetings of Sendai framework. And that integrated ecosystem on the management of natural resources for the reduction of risk of mountain communities. Now, mountain communities have got different type of disasters. I mean, as I've said, it is location-based, country-based. But Sendai framework address in general environmental issues, ecosystems, and not much on the mountain framework. Sendai framework, which is right now prevailing, has got 4 priority actions. Priority 1, understanding risk. Priority 2, governance to measure. Investing in disaster risk reduction. That means disaster risk reduction needs investment in terms of budget, in terms of resources, manpower, priority. Enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better. This slogan is an important slogan for all the disaster managers. Build back better. That means that whatever has happened, the next structure, next infrastructure has to be better. It should be better. I don't know, it goes from place to place. It may be 10% better, 20% better, depending upon the local government priorities. I think I stop here. One or two PPTs I will transfer to tomorrow's lecture. I would welcome questions, answers. Questions? Chat box. You can write your questions in the chat box. And please don't expect I will give all the answers because I am also a learner like you. We will only discuss. No question? Are you able to see the question?
Capacity risk factor.
That I have explained. This is a question from Rishika Pal. What F stands for? F is a way of writing equations in engineering and science. F stands for a function. Function. Any question from Mr. Anand? I take it that, see, no questions, they got two meanings. Okay, all right. So let me have a positive meaning that everything is clear and my learned participants, they have enjoyed the discussion part. So we meet tomorrow and for today's arrangement, I thank Sri Rohit, who is my IT expert for connecting the system. The course director is always there all the time with us. Then tomorrow we'll continue something on the same topic onwards. Okay. So bye bye till then. Thank you very much.